the sword falls. Dust swirls through the air, thick with blood and screams. 80,000 voices erupt, roaring one name. His name. The man who has just killed 3 others beneath the blazing Roman sun. His chest heaves. His gladius drips. His eyes are wide, not with fear, but with hunger. For a single hour, he is no longer a slave. He is a god. Coins rain down from the stands like molten stars. Laurel leaves brush against his sweat-slick hair. But his true reward isn't the gold. It isn't the glory. It waits below, in the cold, torchlit chambers beneath the arena, where Rome's mask of civilization slips away and its heart beats black. There, the screams of the crowd fade into silence. There, the empire's secret rituals unfold. The victors of the arena are granted what Rome called the premium noctis, the reward of the night. But it was no act of love. It was domination, sanctioned by gods and men alike, the consummation of absolute power. Tonight, the champion's blade will rest, but another kind of violence is about to begin. When the gates of the arena finally groaned shut, the world above erupted in celebration, wine spilled, musicians played, and senators toasted the name of the victor. But beneath the marble corridors, where the air reeked of iron, sweat, and torch smoke, another ritual began. The gladiator descended the stone stairs not as a man returning from battle, but as something reborn in blood. His muscles still trembled from the kill, his pulse drummed with the echoes of the crowd's adoration, and in his mind the boundary between man and beast blurred until it vanished. Rome had trained him to be an instrument of death, and now, for a single night, it allowed him to taste the illusion of dominion. They called it the prize of the night, premium noctis. It was whispered through the barracks and baths, spoken of with the same reverence as divine favor. It was not written in law, yet every man in the arena knew it existed. It was the unspoken ritual of reward, the empire's way of feeding its champions, the illusion of freedom. After victory, the lanista, the master of the gladiators, would nod, and a slave woman would be led into the cell. She was the empire's forgotten property, stripped of name, rank, and past. She might have been a prisoner from Dacia, a captive from the deserts of Egypt, or a fallen Roman noblewoman whose family had displeased the Senate. None of it mattered. In that cell, her life was reduced to one purpose: to serve as the empire's living offering to the beast it had created. The gladiator's heartbeat thundered in his skull, still drunk on violence. To the crowd, he was a hero, a spectacle of flesh molded by pain. To himself, he was something both greater and lesser, a weapon that knew only one language: conquest. As the iron door clanged shut, the final applause from the arena echoed faintly through the stone halls like a dying prayer. The silence that followed was suffocating. He could still see the faces of those he had slain, could still feel their final shudders. Yet Rome did not let its killers rest. It transformed that violence into ritual, redirected it toward the body of another captive. For the lanista, this was business. Gladiators were investments, muscle and rage turned into profit. A fighter who believed he held power fought harder. A fighter who believed he was a god was unstoppable. And so, to keep the illusion alive, Rome gave its champions moments like these, moments where the slave was made to feel like a master, even though his chains were invisible. The woman's terror, the sound of the lock, the flicker of torchlight on stone. It was all part of the theater. The empire didn't sell honor. It sold the spectacle of domination. Historians later tried to bury these truths beneath marble myths of courage and virtue, but the graffiti carved into the walls of the Ludus Magnus tell the real story. Names of champions scratched beside crude drawings, victories counted not only by bodies slain in the sand, but by women violated in the night. One name appears again and again, followed by tallies: Chrestus, the terror of Dacia, 15 fights, 20 women. To Rome, this was vitality, proof of the fighter's worth, the essence of his masculine divinity. But to the victims, nameless, unrecorded, it was annihilation. Down there, in the half-light, the gladiator shed his humanity one layer at a time. Every act of violence performed under Rome's blessing forged another link in the chain that bound him. The empire had perfected the psychology of power, to enslave the strong by allowing them to enslave the weak. The gladiator believed he ruled that night, yet he was only fulfilling another command, enacting another piece of the machine. The woman before him was not his prize, she was his mirror, a reflection of everything he had lost. And when it was over, when the torches burned low and the cell filled once more with silence, nothing sacred remained. The gladiator sat in the shadows, breathing hard, the illusion of victory dissolving into the same emptiness that followed every kill. The lanista would collect him in the morning, polish his armor, feed him wine, and send him back into the sunlit horror of the Colosseum, to kill again, to bleed again, to return again to the darkness below. Rome called it glory, but what truly took place beneath the arena was not celebration. It was initiation, a baptism into the empire's darkest faith, that violence was power, and power was divine. When dawn broke over Rome, the city looked divine, marble columns glowing gold, the temples exhaling incense into the morning air, and the streets alive with merchants and processions. But beneath that illusion of order, something monstrous stirred. Every triumph in the arena demanded a sacrifice in the dark, and those who orchestrated it, the lanistae, the financiers, the patrons, understood that Rome's splendor thrived on ritualized brutality. It was not enough for a gladiator to fight. He had to perform the philosophy of the empire, to prove that power was not just taken, but enacted, embodied, and consummated. Each victory was sealed not merely with blood in the sand, but with flesh in the shadows. This was not passion, it was ceremony. The lanista's role was priestly. He managed not just fighters, but the flow of energy between spectacle and subjugation. His arena was a temple of violence, and his gladiators were both sacrifices and gods. He knew how to feed them rage, how to balance their despair with the illusion of privilege. After every successful bout, he orchestrated a second ritual, the nocturnal offering. To the crowd, the gladiator was a beast unleashed. To the empire, he was an essential cog in the machinery of control. By giving him a woman, a slave, a prisoner, a conquered soul, Rome transformed his trauma into dominance, his exhaustion into validation. The act itself was never about pleasure or desire. It was about reaffirming a hierarchy, Rome above man, man above woman, master above life itself. The gladiator, still trembling from the frenzy of combat, stepped into that ritual not as himself, but as an extension of Rome's will. His mind was a battlefield, a storm of pain and adrenaline, pride and emptiness. He did not see the woman as a person, only as an emblem, the embodiment of everything he had conquered, everything he had been commanded to destroy. The torchlight carved her body into fragments of shadow and light, the same way the arena had carved the world into winners and corpses. For him, this was not choice, it was continuity. The slaughter did not end with the final blow in the sand, it simply changed form. To resist was useless. Rome had turned submission into an industry. The women chosen for this ritual came from the corners of the empire, captured Dacians, Syrians, Carthaginians, Thracians, each one a conquered territory made flesh. Their suffering was currency. To Rome's elites, the brutality below was invisible, conveniently buried beneath the noise of celebration. But to those who lived it, the night was endless. The gladiators' violence, once demanded by the crowd, became private, intimate, and systematic. The lanista understood this perfectly. The power to command violence was what sustained the empire's myth of invincibility. And yet, beneath the layers of domination, something darker pulsed, a strange inversion of control. The gladiator, though appearing as master, was in truth the most enslaved of all. Rome had broken his body in training, his will in combat, and his morality in ritual. Each act of forced domination numbed the man within him further, until all that remained was the creature Rome desired, obedient, ruthless, empty. The woman before him, stripped of her dignity, mirrored that emptiness back to him. Her silence reminded him of the silence in his own heart. What the empire had done to her, it had already done to him. In that twisted reflection lay Rome's genius, to make the oppressed perform oppression upon one another, to recycle suffering until it sustained itself. The lanista didn't need chains to control his fighters, he only needed this ritual. It was conditioning, disguised as privilege. The gladiator believed he was being rewarded when, in truth, he was being drained, his soul fed to the same machine that devoured hers. This was how the empire maintained its eternal hunger. The sand ran red above, the stone ran cold below, and between them, humanity was ground into dust. When the ritual ended, the Lannista's guards would open the cell door and drag the woman away. She might live another night, or she might not. The gladiator would be given wine and silence, told to rest for the next games. His body was worth more alive than his conscience was worth saved. And Rome would continue. Streets gleaming, senators smiling, poets singing of honor and courage, while in the hidden chambers beneath that marble city, the true religion of the empire thrived. It was not the worship of Jupiter or Mars, but of domination itself, the sacred rite that declared power holy, pain divine, and humanity expendable. That was the secret that Rome never wrote in its histories, that the empire did not merely conquer nations, it conquered the soul. The Roman Empire did not build its dominance on marble or law alone. It built it on the mastery of human psychology. Its true genius was not the sword, but the system that wielded it, a vast mechanism designed to feed ambition, fear, and desire back into itself, until no one could tell the difference between freedom and servitude. The arena was not merely entertainment, it was a demonstration of control so complete that even the enslaved began to crave their chains. And nowhere was this more evident than in the world of the gladiators, where victory and punishment, pleasure and pain, life and death were all part of the same ritual equation. The Lanista, that sinister architect of the games, understood the machinery better than anyone. He was not just a trainer of fighters, he was a sculptor of the mind. Each blow in training, each lash of discipline, each reward of the flesh served a purpose. He taught his men to equate dominance with existence. To kill was to prove worth. To take was to confirm life. The gladiator who accepted this truth became Rome's ideal creation, a man who could no longer distinguish between survival and cruelty. And yet, this was precisely how the empire sustained itself. Rome's power was not maintained through the obedience of the weak, but through the corruption of the strong. When the crowds roared, they believed they were watching heroes. But the real audience was invisible, senators, priests, and emperors observing how easily men could be turned into instruments of their own enslavement. The gladiator was their mirror, their projection, their fantasy of absolute control. And the rituals that followed the games were designed to reinforce this illusion. The Premium Noctis was not an indulgence, it was an experiment in obedience. It allowed the Lanista to test how far a man could be pushed before the last fragment of conscience shattered. Every act of forced domination below the arena was as important to Rome as every duel above it, for both were lessons in hierarchy, the strong consuming the weak, the master remaking the slave. In the dim corridors beneath the Colosseum, the empire's social order was condensed into its purest form. The gladiator was exalted and humiliated in the same breath. 1 hour he was Jupiter incarnate, worshipped by the masses. The next, he was a pawn enacting the empire's sadism upon another captive. The woman, voiceless and stripped of self, became the vessel through which Rome reaffirmed its doctrine. That power was divine, and divinity required subjugation. Her suffering was not incidental, it was sacred. In her degradation, the empire found proof of its own righteousness. This machinery did not rely on cruelty alone, it relied on belief. The Lanista ensured that his fighters believed in the justice of their actions, that they saw themselves as chosen instruments of a greater order. To question the ritual was to question Rome itself, and such thoughts were more dangerous than any blade. Those who doubted were not executed. They were erased. Their names were never carved on the walls, their victories never recorded. Silence was the empire's preferred tomb. And so the ritual persisted, unchallenged, evolving from generation to generation, until it became indistinguishable from religion. Even the women who suffered within it became part of that machinery. Some were broken into submission, others were consumed by it so completely that they began to believe their only purpose was to serve as offerings. The cycle of violence was perfect in its efficiency, the victim sustaining the killer sustaining the system. Rome had found the ultimate form of renewable energy, human despair. In every cry, in every drop of blood, The empire heard affirmation of its order. It was not chaos. It was choreography, an exquisite ballet of cruelty masked as civilization. And yet, even the most perfect machines contain flaws. Beneath the discipline and spectacle, cracks began to form, invisible at first, like fractures beneath polished marble. Some gladiators began to feel the weight of their victories as curses rather than honors. Some women, broken and returned to their cells, began to whisper prayers not to the gods, but to the ghosts of the men who had died in the sand. The empire believed it had extinguished humanity from its victims and executioners alike. But in its arrogance, it forgot that despair too can awaken something dangerous, something that remembers what it means to be human. Because every empire that builds itself on the destruction of souls eventually creates its own undoing. Rome's machinery of power was vast, magnificent, and merciless. But within its gears, the spark of defiance was already beginning to flicker, fragile, trembling, but alive. Beneath the marble foundations of Rome, far below the golden avenues where senators strolled and poets recited verses of virtue, there existed another world, a labyrinth of stone where the screams of women echoed unheard. The empire called them servants, spoils, offerings, but in truth they were the raw material of its power, the living proof of conquest. Every corner of that subterranean network carried their scent, sweat, fear, blood, and silence. The cellars of the ludus were not prisons by design, they were factories of obedience, where the female body became an instrument of the state's ritualized violence. In those dark chambers, Rome rehearsed its theology of control, a faith where submission was holy and suffering was sacred. The women came from every frontier that Rome had devoured. A Carthaginian maiden who once watched her city burn under the shadow of Scipio's legions. A Celtic girl taken from the smoldering ruins of Britannia, her hair the color of the fire that destroyed her tribe. An Egyptian dancer who had been paraded in the triumph of a general before being handed to the ludus as tribute. Each one carried a fragment of a fallen world, a language silenced, a culture erased. But once the gates closed behind them, all stories ended in sameness. They were renamed, renumbered, and rewritten into the empire's anonymous inventory. To Rome, their value lay only in how they could be used, to entertain, to appease, to discipline, to keep the machine running. What made their suffering more insidious was the ritual's dual nature. Above, the women of noble blood, the patrician wives and senatorial matrons, whispered in secret about the gladiators. They sent gifts, gold, even letters written in trembling hands, begging the lanista for a night with a champion. The very same men who brutalized slaves in darkness were worshipped by the elite as gods of virility. The hypocrisy of Rome was complete. The cruelty inflicted below was sold as passion above. The sweat and blood scraped from the gladiator's skin were bottled and sold as glaum, a luxury perfume and supposed aphrodisiac. In every bottle that adorned the boudoirs of Rome's nobility lingered the scent of the same despair that stained the stones beneath the arena. For the enslaved woman, the ritual was not simply physical, it was existential. She became the boundary between humanity and the abyss. Each night she was forced to face the embodiment of Rome's wrath, a man both victim and weapon, a slave who had been turned into an instrument of divine punishment. Her body was the battlefield on which the empire reaffirmed its own myth, and in that endless repetition, the idea of choice, of personhood, of identity itself dissolved into ritual. The woman no longer existed as a name or memory, she became the silence between two roars of the crowd, the shadow cast by the torch that burned out too quickly. Yet even in that silence, something remained, a residue of defiance, too small to be seen but impossible to extinguish. Some whispered to one another in forbidden tongues. Some scratched names or symbols into the walls of their cells, fragments of prayer, fragments of memory. They were not resistance in the sense Rome feared, but memory itself was rebellion enough. To remember was to deny erasure. To whisper a name was to defy anonymity. Even in a world where every breath could be punished, remembering who you were was an act of treason against the empire. The lanista understood none of this. To him, the women were nothing but logistics, bodies rotated, wounds managed, pregnancies prevented or terminated with crude precision. If a woman survived too long, she was reassigned, sold, or discarded. If she became pregnant, the child's fate was decided before birth. A son might be raised to fight and die like his father. A daughter would inherit her mother's chains. Rome was meticulous even in its cruelty. Nothing was wasted, even despair had purpose. But the empire's perfection was its flaw. Every time a woman whispered a name into the darkness, every time she met the gladiator's eyes and saw, even for an instant, the reflection of her own humanity, the machinery trembled. For all its marble and discipline, Rome had never learned how to kill the soul completely. The empire believed it could erase the past, rewrite the living into silence, and baptize its violence in glory. Yet beneath the stones of its greatest monument, in the chambers that no senator dared enter, the truth festered. That the glory of Rome was written in the suffering of its forgotten women. And in those depths, under the weight of centuries, that suffering began to remember itself. There comes a moment in every system of domination when the machinery begins to turn against itself. Not because it breaks, but because the human spirit it was designed to crush begins to move within it, quietly, like a trapped pulse beneath stone. In the bowels of the ludus, where torches flickered and chains clinked in rhythm with distant cheers, that pulse began to beat. It was faint at first, a look exchanged between captor and captive, a hesitation before the ritual began, a trembling hand that no longer struck with conviction. Rome's architects of cruelty could perfect the law, the blade, and the ritual, but they could never command the invisible tremor of conscience that stirs within even the most broken soul. The gladiator who had once believed himself godlike now began to see the abyss in his own reflection. Each night he entered the cell with the same ritualistic precision, yet something within him shifted, a dissonance between the ecstasy of conquest and the emptiness that followed. The empire had taught him to believe that power was the same as freedom, but the eyes that looked back at him through the shadows told another story. Those eyes did not hate him, they pitied him. In that gaze he saw not submission, but a mirror of his own captivity. For the first time, the roles blurred. Who was the prisoner, the woman locked in the cell, or the man who returned to it night after night, bound not by chains but by the empire's expectations? The lanista never noticed this shift. He measured obedience in blood and victories, not in silence. Yet that silence was where rebellion began to breed. The gladiator no longer felt the same satisfaction after the kill, nor after the night's ritual. The roar of the crowd began to sound hollow, the praise of the emperor more like mockery. He began to understand that the glory of Rome was nothing more than the echo of his own enslavement. Every cheer was a chain, every victory another nail sealing his humanity inside a golden coffin. And in that understanding, the empire's perfect weapon began to fracture. For the woman, too, the rebellion began not in noise, but in recognition. She learned his patterns, his hesitations, the tremor in his breath when he tried to convince himself he was in control. She saw the ghost of the man buried beneath the beast Rome had made. In that recognition she found a kind of power, not the power to resist with violence, but the power to witness. Empires can endure bloodshed, but they cannot endure being seen for what they are. Her gaze became the smallest act of defiance, a quiet exposure of the empire's lie. As the months passed, a strange bond began to form between the two. Not love, for love cannot bloom in a graveyard, but something more primitive and tragic, mutual awareness. She understood his torment, and he understood her silence. Together they formed a conspiracy that no one could name, the conspiracy of remembering that they were still human. Rome had designed them to be symbols, one of strength, the other of submission. Yet in their secret recognition of each other's suffering, they became something Rome had never intended, witnesses to its corruption. And when that moment of reckoning came, when the lanista offered him another woman, younger, fairer, a new reward for his triumph, the illusion finally shattered. For the first time, the gladiator refused. It was a small act, a single syllable whispered through clenched teeth, but in that word lay the collapse of the entire system. No. The lanista froze, not from fear, but from disbelief. A slave who refuses is no longer a slave. That single act of defiance was the empire's greatest nightmare, the awakening of conscience within its most obedient creation. They called it rebellion, but it was not a war, it was an awakening. The gladiator understood that his body belonged to Rome, but his will did not. The woman understood that her silence had never been consent, it had been endurance. Together, in their final act, they tore apart the illusion of divine power that had ruled over them both. When the crowd demanded blood, when the emperor signaled death, the gladiator turned not upon his captive, but upon his master. The sword that had once obeyed Rome now defied it. The beast Rome had forged became its executioner. His body fell soon after, pierced by the arrows of imperial guards. But the act could not be undone. The crowd gasped, the emperor turned pale, and for the first time in memory, silence reigned over the Colosseum. The machine had been momentarily broken by the very soul it sought to erase. And though his body was burned, though the woman was dragged away and erased from record, the echo of that rebellion endured. For in that brief instant, beneath the marble and the blood, something sacred had returned, the unbearable truth that no system, no empire, no ritual, no god can completely kill the human will to choose. Rome continued, of course. The games went on, the crowds cheered again. But something invisible had changed. Every torch lit beneath the arena cast a shadow that looked suspiciously like doubt. And that doubt, quiet, unseen, unstoppable, was the first crack in the marble heart of an empire that believed itself eternal. So, when you walk among the ruins of Rome today, and the wind moves through the broken arches of the Colosseum, listen closely. Beneath the whisper of dust and stone, you may still hear the faint echo of that defiance. The breath of two forgotten souls who, for one night, reminded the empire that gods can bleed. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, like, share, and subscribe, because history only dies when we stop telling it.